Sometimes the best stories in golf aren't found on tour. You'll find them at the back of the range. And here's your host, Ben Adelberg.
Welcome to the Back of the Range Golf Podcast. I am your host, Ben Adelberg. This is episode 113. You know, before I left for the Latin America Amateur Championship, I remembered that I'm out of town again this week. No, not another golf tournament. I got to work this week. So since I wasn't going to be in front of the microphone, I figured I'd get this episode loaded so we wouldn't skip a week. We don't do that around here. We bring episodes each and every week, interviews with amateurs, professionals, college players, college coaches, you name it. We do it every single week here at the Back of the Range. So you're not going to hear me talk about Mayakoba, the Latin America Amateur Championship, in this episode. But if you want to see some amazing pictures and videos from Mayakoba, I know that I've posted them already on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So follow along there, subscribe in Apple Podcast and Spotify, and go to the website, thebackoftherange.com, to listen to all the previous episodes. In fact, there's probably some interviews up on the Instagram page. Maybe I grabbed some souvenirs and I'm giving them away. You want to go follow this podcast on Instagram. The handle is the Back of the Range Podcast. Once I get back home, once I get back in the studio, I will give a full recap of the LAC and hopefully have some pretty cool announcements to make at that time. So this week's episode is Mike Muehr from Mclean, Virginia. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is a former heavyweight boxing champion on the Back of the Range golf? But no, you're thinking of Michael Muehr, different guy. But I'll tell you, if you're too young to remember when George Foreman knocked out Michael Muehr to win the heavyweight championship at the age of 45, I will not be offended if you pause this and go look it up on YouTube, because I just did that myself. In fact, I will actually put the link in the show notes of this episode to that clip on YouTube because, well, hey, the oldest heavyweight champion in history, got to show respect. No, Mike Muehr, this week's guest, might not be someone that you're familiar with in the world of golf. His name is spelled a little bit differently. He did make it to the PGA Tour, but after a couple of years, he kind of disappeared. Mike eventually got back into playing golf on the amateur level. He basically got his status back so he could play in these member guests he kept getting invited to. But once that happened, the world of mid-amateur golf opened up, and the cocktail circuit came calling. And before you know it, he was racking up wins at places like Pine Valley and Seminole. He competes on the national level, and while I've spoken with plenty of awesome mid-ams here at the Back of the Range, you got to put Mike Muehr's resume up there with the best of them. So let's get started with this week's episode. I think you're really going to like this one. Mike, welcome to the Back of the Range. How are you?
Great, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
You're coming off a pretty darn good couple of years. You win the Coleman at Seminole down here in South Florida in 2018. You win the Crump for the third time at Pine Valley in 2019. Let's get it out of the way. What are you doing in 2020? Olympic run or master? What are we doing in 2020? How are we going to top all this?
I don't know, Ben. You know, I think I've mastered the cocktail tour, what we refer to.
Oh yeah,
that run of the Crump and the Coleman and all that stuff, the George Thomas. So I don't know, maybe that's just my age or whatnot, or my priorities, but I really enjoy the playing with the old guys, the mid amateurs, and have found some success at some of these venues, some of the Hall of venues, and I get to pick my spots. I play 2 or 3, sometimes 4 tournaments a year, and at the best courses in the world, and have a lot of fun doing it. So it's great. It's a great scene at these events, and I guess I just thrive in that, the little less pressure, not the pressure cooker of the PGA Tour.
Okay, so you mentioned the PGA Tour. You played a couple full seasons, and I know you were on the Nationwide Tour, or whatever it was called at that particular time. It's obviously the Korn Ferry now, and I want to get back into your pro days and help me out, but I got to talk about your career at Duke. I mean, I'm a Kansas guy, and I have to talk to another Dookie. I can't believe I'm doing this to myself, but I'm going to do it anyway. But you just mentioned something very interesting. When you hear about players at the highest level, they're like, I got to get my reps in. I got to play more tournaments. I got to get more tournament tough. And you're telling me that you play 3 to 4 tournaments a year, And these aren't just like your local county amateur. These are the biggest and most competitive mid-amateur tournaments in the world. How are you succeeding without a whole lot of tournament experience annually?
That's a good question. Maybe because my livelihood doesn't depend on it, and I can just kind of go out and play the way I practice, which is a few cocktails and no pressure, no preparation, and just let it go. And again, I played almost 10 years professionally, and it's just a completely different deal. And I was never much of a practicer back then either. And so it's just, I think the recipe for the type of golf I play now, it just works for me. I get to go out and challenge myself, again, 3 or 4 times a year against some of the best. And frankly, some of these mid-amateur players, they are the best amateur players in the world. Some of them, the guys like, Harvey and Parziale and these guys, and they do play full schedules, and they are really, really good. So to be able to challenge with those guys a couple times a year is frankly enough for me.
Well, I mean, the 4 semifinalists in the Crump last year, it's you and Parziale. You took him down in extra holes, and then Harvey had to go extra holes. He had to go 20 holes to take out Skip Berkmeyer. I have had those 3 guys on the podcast as well. So that schedule doesn't suit you. You don't see yourself being a full-time 10 to 15 event kind of a mid-am just chasing it around.
No, even if I wanted to, Ben, I couldn't. I've got 3 kids, 12, 11, and 9, with active in sports and a job that doesn't really allow me to do that. And frankly, the 3 or 4 when I'm done, if I don't play really well, I tend to remind myself why I don't do it for a living. But
okay.
It's enough for me. My wife refers to me as America's guest because I can still play fairly well, and so I get invited to a lot of member guests. So I get outside of those 3 or 4 very competitive events, I get another 4 or 5 fun member guests, and that takes up enough time.
All right, so let's go right there. You're giving me you're sending me in all different directions here. That's fine. So member guests, what is maybe one of the member guests that you've been invited to where you get to the joint and you're like, okay, I've seen a lot of things. I've spent some time at Pine Valley. I've spent some time at Seminole. But as far as like an over-the-top party, not so much about, okay, grinding out, 9-footers for par, but an over-the-top party where you're like, man, I don't even care what we shoot. This is just fun. I got to get back to this thing.
Yeah, there's a few of those. The ones at like at Congressional, that's a good one. There's actually one here locally at the TPC at Avenel. They do an incredible spread. There's some that have Calcuttas. The one at the Trump course here in Virginia, it used to be called Rose Island. Our member guest was a blast. We had a massive Calcutta that they've since gotten rid of. I think that it got around town and people were coming in with inflated handicaps and just got a little out of whack. But one really good story was there's a club out here in Northern Virginia called Creighton Farms, really nice Nicholas design venue, and I was asked to play with a guy that I knew pretty well. Our wives went to college together, and so it turns out it's the typical 9-hole matches, and he was a really bad golfer. I mean, he hadn't played in like 15 or 20 years. He was a new member of the club. He thought he'd bring me in, and I knew more people than he did, frankly. And so we're plugging along, but he's a good athlete, and I'm kind of coaching him around the golf course for the first 2 or 3 days, and we end up missing the horse race by like a half a point. So we're sitting around lunch, and somebody says, "Oh, guys, you made the horse race as the wild card. The most points that didn't win their flight." And I said, "That's great. Well, what's the format?" And he said, "Well, the member has to tee off, and we're starting on 15. It's a pretty severe penal par 3, about 185 yards over a bunch of junk and almost an island green, and the member has to hit first." So I said, "Okay, that's great." So we drive out there. There's about 30 carts behind the green. There's about 10 behind us on the tee, and we're first up. And he says, "What do you like? You like the hybrid, the 2 hybrid, the 3 hybrid?" I said, "Heath, I think you should pull out your putter." He said, "Huh?" I said, "Come down here." I showed him where there were no divots. I said, "See this spot about 3 feet in front of the ball? Just putt it to right there. Don't hit it in any divots and don't hit it into the rough." And, the guy, it's awful. I like to say it's awfully lonely atop that mountain of pride. He had no problem. He's pulled his putter out and tapped it about 2 feet. And the guys around the tee start laughing. And sure enough, the other, 12 guys that got up, 4 of them hit it in the junk, a couple hit it in the bunker, a couple hit it in the woods. And it was my turn. I got up with a 6-iron hit to a foot. And we won the horse race, and it was beautiful. And it was I was around town the rest of that year. I heard a couple guys talking. Oh, there's this guy that made his partner hit putter off the tee, and it became lore around here. It was pretty funny, and that was one of the better member guest stories. He took it like a champ, and no pride, just tapped it ahead, and we won.
That's
that was pretty fun.
I mean, that's a routine par in my book. I mean, that's
yeah, right.
I mean, what's wrong with that?
Hey, there's no pictures on the scorecard, as they say.
That is exactly right. We won't.
Man, as Clint Eastwood said a long time ago, man needs to know his limitations, right? So
hey,
pretty high likelihood he would have dumped it in the junk with the rest of them.
I don't even want to know what that thing paid out. We'll just keep that. We'll keep that on the cutting room floor of this episode. You mentioned you got 3 kids. Leads me into a little bit about junior golf. All-American. You're an All-American in the late '80s at AJGA, and then went on to a great college career at Duke. How did Duke come into the picture? Because if you're an All-American, and I'm just speculating, but you're an All-American junior golfer, probably had your choice of a lot of different places. I'd imagine as a kid, you're thinking, I'm going to play in the PGA Tour someday. And Duke is very challenging academically. Not saying you can't handle it, but is it a place you go that you want to get molded for the PGA Tour? How did Duke come to be?
Yeah, you've done your research. All-American as a junior. I was an AJGA All-American, and one of the things that really pushed me towards Duke, you're allowed to visit 5 schools. I visited Stanford. Wally Goodwin's the coach. He was an amazing guy. In fact, Casey Martin and Nota Begay and I were all on the same recruiting visit the same weekend. Notre Dame was in playing Stanford, and they obviously ended up going there. And I didn't love it. And I looked at UNC and UVA and Wake and Duke. And the fall prior, I was playing in an AJGA kind of their season-ending event at Innisbrook. And it's a match play event. It was called the Rolex at the time. I don't even know if they still have anything like it, but I got paired against this kid who was a year older than me. I was maybe a junior in high school at the time, and his name was Jason Widener. And Jason absolutely wore me like a hat that day. I think he beat me like 9-8, and I was pretty good. I think I ended up being maybe the 2nd or 3rd ranked junior my senior year. So I was a pretty good, first team All-American, all that BS. And he ended up going to Duke, and I just had this revere for Jason, and we became really good friends at Duke. And I'd say he was one of the reasons I chose Duke. Obviously, there were much bigger reasons, but I love the school. It had this great collegiate environment and great academics, great athletics. But the team was really becoming a powerhouse with Jason a year ahead of me, and they'd gotten another 2nd team All-American, a kid named Tom Hurley from Connecticut, and it just my good buddy from the AJJ, a kid named Aaron Cruz from Ohio. He was a 2nd team All-American. So we were stacked, and we just kind of all agreed to go there, and we had a blast there. We underachieved as a team because there was a lot of time being dedicated towards just frankly being able to stay in school there. It's a really tough place, and so I think our golf suffered to some degree. But we had a great time. I wouldn't give it up for anything. The experiences we all had there together, and I always said that you can, if you want to play on the PGA Tour, you can go to. I think Zach Johnson went to Drake or someplace like that in Iowa. So you can go anywhere and do it if you kind of have the talent and the will after college to dedicate to doing it. So
I was just going to say, so you're there at Duke, and gosh, I mean, as a Jayhawk, this pains me to say, but you're there. I think it's like your freshman and sophomore year when Duke basketball wins national championships. So I know it's a golf podcast, but what is it like being on campus and also being an athlete? You're a little bit different than just the standard student, but what is it like being on campus when you got Hurley, Leitner, and Grant Hill rolling around there? What is that life like?
Well, sorry to rehash probably a sensitive moment for you, but I was in Cameron Indoor Stadium watching the final game in 1991 when Duke beat Kansas. Grant Hill had the big catch and the dunk, the alley-oop dunk from half court.
Yep.
So it was a great time. I was the same age as Grant, and we had a class together. I stayed for one summer. We had a class together and used to go hit golf balls at the driving range. But obviously those guys were celebrities on campus, and a lot of them are great guys. One guy, and I've gotten to know pretty well since then, is a guy, Jay Billis, who not my same time, but he's a wonderful guy and avid golfer. fellow member at a club up in New Jersey. So that's just Coach K has done an awesome job, raising these kids into really good people. And there was a great time to be there. Fortunate to know a few of these guys.
Yeah. Well, because of that, I will not be sending you a courtesy a gift basket from the Back of the Range Golf podcast, since you had to mention that Kansas loss. But yeah, it's incredible what they've done, and then also obviously what Kansas has done. But I wasn't on campus when KU was when they won in 08. I was there around that 95-96 time, that Jacques Vaughn, Rafe LaFrance, Ostertag kind of era. So.
Those are the Roy Williams years, right?
Exactly right.
No,
you're 100%.
Yeah,
100% right.
And Matt, I'll tell you what, I got to tell you, Matt Gogol was one of my very best friends and favorite people from when I was on the tour.
Yeah,
he was a Kansas boy, and we had a lot of back and forth those years, kind of 2000 to 2003 when we were running around together.
Now he won his lone tournament at Pebble, and then he runnered up to Tiger one year at Pebble. I believe you've played Pebble. Does it get much better than Pebble Beach on tour?
You know what? I never understood. Some guys don't like to play the event because you're playing with celebrities or amateurs, and the weather's usually pretty crappy, and the Poena greens are bumpy. And frankly, it's just, if I had one round of golf to play, it's at Pebble Beach, and it's just a magical place. And I remember the day when he finished runner-up, and it was because Tiger holed out that wedge on 16, spun it down the hill and in, and then I think he won the next year. Matt did.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were consecutive years or maybe there was a year between, but I think it was the next year that he came back and won it. So he was a great player, a great, really fun guy, and that place is just it's magical. Love it.
I read previously, in I think an interview you did, or just maybe some sort of a statement that you did a while back, where you referred to yourself as a mediocre college player. Is that correct?
That'd be fair to say. I won one tournament. I won Stanford's tournament my sophomore year, and I might have finished second another 6 or 7 times. So I certainly was not a stellar college player. I was a decent college player.
Okay.
Again, I kind of let school get in the way of that, but that was all right. I had a great experience, a very balanced time in my 4 years.
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking that question is not to pull out your finishes on your college career, but just to illustrate the fact that you get to the PGA Tour. Keep your card in 01, go again in 02. I mean, you had several years on the nationwide tour, but I guess my question is, how do you look at your college playing career and then decide I'm going to turn professional and chase down the dream of making it to the PGA Tour? Were there factors that allowed you to make that decision, as opposed to, well, here's what I did in college. I beat this guy, and this guy, and they're doing it. I'm just curious how that decision gets made.
Yeah, it was never really that. I think it's kind of more of a symptom of having golf just being the centerpiece of my childhood. I, from a very young age, very competitive, got to, be a very competitive junior golfer. And I was always maybe a little slower to move up into the age groups. When I'd bump up to the 15 to 18 age group, it would take me a couple of years before I, experienced a lot of success. And, college, my senior year, I actually played pretty well. I finished second a couple of times, maybe 3 or 4 times. And, it was just kind of the natural progression. I figured, God, if I'm going to do this, I got to do it. Yeah. And the alternative was probably law school. And I figured, the world has enough lawyers. So I gave it a shot, and I was fortunate too. Financially, my parents sort of, kind of semi-sponsored me. I actually approached it kind of like a business. I put together a syndicate of sponsors, friends, and acquaintances that chipped in, kind of like betting on a horse, and did that for 3 or 4 years, and they weren't really losing money by the end, which was a good thing, because typically those are throwing good money down the drain. But and each year I kind of progressed a little bit. I played in Europe my second year. First year I just played wherever I could find a place to play. Second year I played in Europe for a year, which was my favorite year of all.
Really?
Just had an incredible time. Lived in London and traveled to a different place, mostly in continental Europe, every week. It was just it was incredible. met some great people over there. I was one of 2 Americans at the time. Craig Hainline being the other from Oklahoma State, and then came back and got my card for what was then I believe it was still the Nike. It became the Buy.com tour.
Right.
So I did that for 4 straight years. I was fully exempt, and each year just kind of got a little bit better. Maybe 80th on the money list my first year, then 50th, and my 4th year I finished 21st, which got me. I just missed getting my card, and so I got right to the finals again that year, and got through the finals in 2000. So it was a culmination of 6 or 7 years of just kind of paying my dues. And there were a couple points in time where I really thought maybe I'd done it and I was ready to move on and do something else away from golf. And I think I look back, there were a couple little pivot points that it could have gone sideways or could have gone the wrong way. One of them being I was playing at second stage at a place called Greenleaf Resort, which I think is a cow field now.
Haines City, Florida. I've played
Haines City, Florida. And I'll tell you what, it was a awesome, I want to say it was a Robert Trent Jones golf course, middle of Florida, and they always overseeded it for Q School, and it was a fantastic test of golf. I would say back then when it was really kept up, one of the top probably 10 courses in Florida. And it was a second stage, and I was in a playoff for an alternate spot, which nobody doesn't show up for the finals of Q School. And I was in a playoff with Jim McGovern, who was multiple winner on tour, and he could have cared less. And but I was 27 years old and had nothing better to do, so we went out and he just kind of half-assed it around. I won the playoff and became an alternate. Well, it turns out I was still kind of conditional on the web.com or what was then Nationwide or buy.com. I think it was buy.com. And so I showed up at I had finished top 25 the last event of the year. Even though I didn't have much status, I showed up at the next event, and because I was an alternate, I had status on that tour for that year.
Wow.
And I showed up, I finished top 25 the first event of the year, which got me to the next one. I finished top 25 again. I literally parlayed that alternate spot from second stage into being, conditional and fully exempt on that tour that year. And then 2 years later, I get through Q School. And I really was close to packing it in at that point. If I had no status, I would have gotten the job at that point.
So you're saying if Jim McGovern wakes up in a different mood that day, that could really have altered the
Absolutely.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was a real pivot point. And I knew it at the time. A couple weeks in, I'm like, I was ready to bag it here a couple months ago, and I got some momentum, and I think I finished 21st that year on the Nationwide.
Did you ever cross paths with Jim McGovern after that?
A bunch of times. Oh, sure. We played on the tour a few times after that. I just saw him this summer, as a matter of fact.
Does he know this story?
I don't know if he does. He's such an awesome guy. I ran a charity event after I quit playing golf here in DC for 10 years, and he would always come and support it. And he was one of the good dudes. He, never took himself too seriously. Always a pleasure to be on the golf course with. Treated people really, really well around him. He's now the head pro, I think, at White Beaches up in New Jersey. So I saw him this summer, actually. I went up and played the New Jersey Open. My kids were away at camp, and I needed something to do, and it was at Trump Bedminster, which is a great track. So I bumped into him in the locker room, and we had a few laughs about the old days. But he's doing well, and where he grew up in North Jersey. So I don't know if he knows the story. I probably
we'll have to make sure he gets this episode on his phone so he can listen to it. So
yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned you get up there this is, I think we're just about the same age. I think it might be a couple of years younger, but right around that time, I started really following golf, and 2001 is that first full season that you're on the PGA Tour, and that's, I believe, is the Masters is when Tiger completed the Tiger Slam, and there's these big hitters that are on the tour, but I'm looking at a lot of the names that won that year, and you have a Scott Verplank, and you have a Chris DeMarco and Bob Estes, who I just talked to a couple weeks ago. And I don't think that the distance explosion had quite started yet. I know there are some of the outliers, but tell me about your game and about maybe the culture, so to speak, on the PGA Tour, because it's like almost like it's at that gap where things are about to go in that direction where you got.
Well, it's all correlated with 2002 is when the Pro V1
Pro
came
V1,
out.
yeah.
Yep. And so, and I know that because I was a pretty average driver of the golf ball. I wasn't really long by any means. I was probably on the shorter side of average, and I wasn't really straight either.
Okay.
I had a really solid iron game, and the reason I remember 2002 being that transformative year was it was my second year on tour, and driving distances literally went through the roof that year because of that golf ball. It went from, I want to say the average was like 270 to 282 or something like that, which is a pretty big jump. Now
Right.
It's probably 300 yards, but and my driving distance went down 12 yards.
Because you didn't switch the ball.
No. Well, I didn't switch the ball, but also in hindsight, I don't know if you read this, but I had stage 4 cancer. My caddy, I was always, instead of practicing after golf, again, I was never a big practicer, but typically, if good or bad, you'd want to go hit balls, and I was always just, buddy, I'm going to head back to the hotel. I don't feel up for it, and
right.
So, in hindsight, when everybody else was getting longer, I was getting shorter for health reasons. So, but back to your question, I was average at everything, really, frankly, with the exception of iron play. And if I putted really well on certain days, I'd have good scores. But I think the way the golf courses are set up now, if you don't hit it 300 yards and pretty straight, you have a very short career ahead of you on tour.
Yeah,
it's a different game. So,
I wanted to ask. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to ask this question, but there were 2 PGA Tour events that were canceled at the very close of that season. There was the event in Tampa, which I'm assuming most people, think about the Valspar. It was actually at the end of the calendar year, and then there's also a WGC event that was canceled, and it was canceled due to 9/11. And I don't think I've ever had the chance to talk to anyone that was playing on the tour that year. Or I've never had the thought to ask it, but do you remember how that changed the culture or how it affected things on the PGA Tour, whether it's about travel or maybe even size of galleries? I'm just curious if you remember anything specific that jumped out at that time.
It's one of those things where everybody remembers where they were at 9/11. Right. I was on the island course at Innisbrook playing a pro-am.
Yeah.
We had gone through the turnhouse and saw the towers on fire, and we were all just kind of dazed. We went onto the back 9, and then we heard that the towers fell, and so we all walked off the golf course. Sure. And then we were stuck in Tampa. Obviously, all flights were canceled, and after about 2 days, when it looked like they canceled the event, I think the next day, and so we waited another day to see when we could get out of there, and it became evident that we weren't going anywhere anytime soon. So I drove home to DC from Tampa with a J.J. Henry's caddy who was going on to Connecticut, but. And then the next week, ironically, we were in the 84 Lumber in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes from where the other plane crashed in Somerset, Pennsylvania. And driving around up there, all these little small towns, they were all the hotels were filled with the black Crown Vics, all the FBI cars.
Sure.
And so it was surreal going from one to the next, and that plane flew right over the golf course, Laurel Valley, where we played. So yeah, it's one of those things. I remember exactly where I was, and I was right on the cusp of keeping or not keeping my card. I was right on that 125 bubble, and so those events were really valuable to me. But obviously, that was not even a concern at that point. I think we still had 4 or 5 events left, and I had a couple good finishes. I think just prior to that, and gosh, I remember I missed the cut in the final event of the year. It was Mississippi, and it was just one of those things I had to sit and wait, and it was brutal. I remember, I think I ended up finishing 121st, but it could have gone the wrong way. I was hitting refresh on the laptop every 10 minutes to see who was going to make the cut and who wasn't, and it worked out all right. So,
I know you kept your card for 2002, and I guess the casual golf fan would, if they're looking at where things went in 2002, 2003, they would say, "Oh, this guy's lost his game and he's back down at the Nationwide Tour, buy.com, whatever you want to call it." But there's a pretty specific reason and thing that kind of took you off the tour that perhaps like I said, the casual golf fan probably might have missed. So, I mean, what was kind of happening in 2002 that kind of led to you being off the tour?
A couple of years after I was done playing, I bumped into somebody. Oh, Mike, I haven't seen you. What you been doing? And because it's such a transitive type of career.
Yeah.
Guys are coming and going all the time. And you don't even realize, like, oh, geez, so and so is not around anymore. And so I had played almost a full season, 20 some events. I want to say 25 events in 2002, and in the mid-August or late August, I had been home for a week and went to see my derm, and she took off a mole off of my Achilles area right above my shoe line on the back of my foot. And I was playing in Scott McCarron's Pro-Am in Sacramento right after Reno Tahoe the following week, and she called me and said, geez, the lesion that we took off, you need to come back. It's melanoma, and it's deep enough and severe enough that we're going to have to take, much larger margins, check lymph nodes, et cetera. And just out of ignorance, I thought, geez, just cut it out and I'll be on my way.
Right.
And it turned out it was, metastasized in my lymph nodes and moving around in my body. So stage 4, I had to, really there was very few treatments at the time. And, meeting with some oncologists, the one I ended up seeing for the next 20 years, still see to this day at Johns Hopkins, essentially told me, based on the severity of my lesion and the fact that it was metastasized and in my lymph nodes in my groin area, that I probably had a 35% chance of making it past 5 years.
Wow.
And he said, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I'm a professional golfer. He says, so you mean you're out on the driving range? I said, no, I'm on the tour, and I'm out, 7 days a week, or, sometimes 5. I missed the cut, but, and he says, okay, well, let's remove that, lower that down to 25%. And so that was a red light for me. It was a easy decision to walk away from golf. And I had like 10 events left in 2003. So after a year of treatments, I went out and just kind of kicked it around for those 10 events and knew I'd already made my decision, but
right.
I didn't know what I wanted to do for a living at that point. And so I went out and played out the medical. And ironically, the last tournament as a professional was at Pebble Beach. It was the Callaway Invitational. I think it's a TaylorMade sponsored event now. It's in November, and same format as the AT&T, and a bunch of pros, 80 pros from all the different tours. And I was leading the event on Sunday at Pebble Beach, playing with John Daly and Todd Fisher and Bo Van Pelt, the 4 of us together. And I had like a 2-shot lead, and I'm playing with John Daly, and we're through like 8 or 9 holes, and I'm playing great. The weather's beautiful. We're at Pebble Beach, and I tell him I'm quitting the next day. He literally couldn't get his head around it. What do you mean? I said, well, I'm going to go get a job. He's like, what do you mean? Like, this is your job. So I said, no, I'm packing it. I got a job lined up as an agent. And it was really funny just to get his kind of reaction, but he ended up birdieing 5 or 6 of the last 10 holes and beat me by 3 or 4.
So it didn't bother him that much, is what you're saying, but it's still
it didn't
right,
bother. Yeah. No. But he just couldn't get his head around that concept. It was pretty funny. And,
wow.
So, and frankly, I haven't looked back. I would have been a marginal tour player, kind of the guy who's always on the cusp. A good year, I might have finished 50th or 70th. A bad year, I'd be outside looking in and back on the web.com or the Corn Ferry Tour, and so it would always have been a grueling nomadic thing for me to bounce around, and I was ready. I had no regrets at that point, and frankly, was the luckiest guy walking around.
Sure.
To be, so.
Wow. So you mentioned and health wise, you're good now. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah. I'm almost 20 years removed. Yeah. I'm I guess 18 years removed now, and I did an experimental kind of vaccine form of immunotherapy that was the precursor for all the PD-1 drugs that are out on the market now. And so I was really, really lucky. And, I had more PET scans and CAT scans. And, I eventually told my oncologist, if melanoma isn't going to kill me, all these scans are all the nuclear medicine they're pumping into me. So
yeah,
I was really lucky. And in hindsight, I was in the right place at the right time to get the right treatment. So,
well, that's great for that. So,
Yeah.
Let's move. You mentioned something I want to hit on. You mentioned you transitioned. Your first job was being an agent. So you go to, I believe it's Octagon. You go to Crown Sports. You're an agent. So what is that transition like? You're out on tour playing, and now you're an agent for some of the guys that are out on tour. What were your responsibilities? Right off the bat as an agent.
Yeah, that was, it was the path of least resistance, I think, Ben. I didn't really know what I wanted to do.
Okay.
And I thought, geez, I can go, I know all these guys. My agents at the time were Octagon and Jimmy Johnston, who I had known for a long time back my early days playing. He had played at Georgia Tech, awesome player and a great guy. He had just moved to Sea Island to work with Mac Barnhart. They were both, Mac was down in Sea Island handling all the Davis Love stuff and some of the other clients that they had bought. They had bought Vinnie Giles' company called Prozinc in Richmond. And so they had Justin Leonard and Tom Kite, and, really nice client base. And so we were at Octagon, the three of us, and then we thought, geez, we should be doing this, hang our own shingle out. And so we broke off and started Crown Sports and based in Sea Island. And we immediately got all these guys, Jonathan Bird and Lucas Glover and Boo Weekley.
Kuchar, I think, right?
Brant Snedeker. Kuchar was after the fact. He wasn't there when I was there. Boo Weekley was one. Joe Durant. Just really good guys. Guys that were personable, that we could sell. And I thought it was going to be an easy thing to do. And it turns out it was really not cut out. I was not cut out for it. I just it was a really mundane kind of existence. You go out and, glad hand on the range and take guys to dinner and constantly trying to prove your value and your worth and your 15%, to the guys. And,
right.
Frankly, in hindsight, I think there's probably 25 guys that need an agent on tour. The rest could probably do a lot of it themselves if they wanted to.
Okay.
So it just, the writing was on the wall for me. I did it for a couple of years and eventually realized that I had to move on. So finance is something that I always kind of wanted to do and followed the stock market as a young kid and moved, transitioned over to wealth management.
I think most casual golf fans, maybe they know of Tiger's agent, Mark Steinberg. Maybe they know Chubby Chandler, who handled Rory and Westwood and that crew, and Graham McDowell. But they probably don't know a lot more about agents and what they tend to deal with. Not to walk you back through every single role and responsibility you had, but, what does an agent do? Maybe like what's the fire that you always had to kind of put out? Or, what would an agent's role be during a time where maybe a player kind of gets, caught up in the air in an interview or has to withdraw last minute and there's media? Like, what are maybe some of the things that maybe the casual golf fan does not understand that an agent actually steps in and takes care of for the player?
It's from player to player. I think some of the really high level players that have a lot of scrutiny and a lot of media interaction, there's probably a lot more for an agent to get involved with on a day-to-day basis. And I can't really speak as much to that as, what we were doing was, negotiating contracts mostly with the manufacturers on behalf of the players, constantly, introducing a new opportunity, whether, typically in the off season, if they wanted to switch equipment, we were out, trying to find corporate endorsements, appearance fees, that type of thing. And really just kind of being an advisor to them. In terms of the day-to-day stuff, it was, I just didn't enjoy that stuff. And so I didn't do it.
Okay.
But Tiger's needs are a lot different than Boo Weekley's needs. Right. And
I'd love to know what Boo Weekley's needs were.
Yeah, they weren't many. He was a pretty simple dude and a lot of funny guy. Oh my gosh. an orangutan story that's just priceless. I don't even know if I'm at liberty to say, but it's a classic. But maybe you can get Boo on your you got to get Boo on your podcast.
I would love to have Boo on the podcast. I mean, yeah.
I'll let him tell the orangutan story because it's amazing.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean it's not Jerry Maguire by any means. It's I think Steiny did a great job with Tiger, and he saw the writing on the wall and broke off and kind of did his own thing there. And it's very competitive. The guys, there's a lot, I'd say there's a handful of agencies that kind of control probably 90% of the players on tour. And
right.
when I say control, represent
right.
90% of the players on tour. And they mostly really good guys. There's some that I wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with, but they're all really competitive. And, but at the same time, they play well together. And, I still, I like a lot of those guys. It wasn't the people. I just didn't really love the work.
Right.
So it was pretty mundane.
At this time you're not playing professionally anymore. You're an agent for a couple of years, and you get into the financial space. What did you really know about as you said, the cocktail circuit, mid-amateur golf? When did that start taking shape where you're like, hey, I kind of want to kick it around a little bit, which you can do in member guests. You can do, I guess you probably had to get your amateur status back to playing those member guests, didn't you?
I did. So I last played professionally in like the summer of 2003.
Okay.
And so I really didn't play anything for 4 years. And I was just looking at the schedule of amateur events. And that year, the U.S. Amateur was at Olympic Club, and the U.S. Mid Amateur was at Bandon Dunes. I thought, geez, that sounds pretty good. Frankly, the PGA Tour does not play good golf courses, believe it or not. They play 15 TPC courses, which are fine.
Right.
They're okay, and TPC at Sawgrass is awesome, but the rest of them are, they're serviceable, but they're not great golf courses. They do not get to play the classics outside of the U.S. Open rotation. And geez, if I could qualify for the U.S. So I went out and I first wrote a letter to the USGA and said, I'm interested in getting my amateur status back. I had to tell them how much money I made, how long I played, and when was the last time I played. And I got a letter back immediately saying, you're good to go. So I qualified for the amateur.
Wait a minute. Let's just slow this down real quick. You wrote a letter saying, hi, played, X amount of years on the nationwidebuy.com. I was a card-carrying member on the PGA Tour for 2 full years. And you write a letter, and they said, all right, fine. That's how it went?
That's how it went. They said, when was the last time you played? I said, 4 years. So that became my waiting period. And frankly, at the time, it was a 2-year. You had to, if you made any money and played any extensively whatsoever, it was going to be at least a 2-year wait.
Okay.
And I've heard of, I've got one story since then of an 8-year wait, but I didn't make a ton of money. I think over my PGA Tour career, I might have made $1 million between the tour and,
right.
We keep calling it a different name, today's Corn Ferry Tour. So, it wasn't a lifetime career for me. And so after 4 years, I said, yeah, you're that waiting period satisfies, what we, see as somebody who's fully removed from professional golf. And so, ironically, I was up at Pine Valley playing. Somebody invited me to go up there, and I got paired with Gordon Brewer, who was the president of the club at the time and a senior legend. And I played really well. We were playing 2 guys from the UK in a little match, and Gordon and I beat him pretty handily. It was their 2 best players. And he said, I'll never forget, we're sitting at lunch. He says, well, Michael, how would you like to play in the Crump Cup? I said, well, geez, Mr. Brewer, that would be fantastic. And I had to look up what the heck the Crump Cup was, because I had no clue,
right,
to be honest. And so sure enough, 3 months later, I was invited to play in the Crump and wasn't ready and did not make the championship flight, and then won like 12 matches straight going into the following year. I won it, and I was medalist and won the tournament. And so kind of got entrenched into the cocktail tour at that point. But it was just really by chance getting paired with Gordon Brewer that, it might have inevitably happened later, further down the road, but that's how I got first introduced to it.
Is it even possible to compare the environment around a typical PGA Tour event with something like the Crump or the Coleman?
No. But I'll tell you what, the European tour is very much like the mid-amateur circuit.
Really? Okay.
It's very much like it. In Europe, everybody pretty much stays at 2 hotels because there's a couple travel companies that orchestrate the travel for all the, everybody just buys the travel package to XYZ event. So it includes airfare, hotel, transfers, all that stuff. And so you end up having, 50 or 60 guys at a place. And this may have changed, but we'd all, meet up for dinner. Everybody go to dinner together. Nobody traveled with their families or their wives. It was just guys on their own. And after golf, guys would practice, but then they'd go into the bar. They'd have a couple beers, and they'd be really happy for you if you played well. They were honestly, happy for you.
Yeah.
And versus the tour here, where guys would go grind for 3 or 4 hours. They'd go back. They'd order room service, or a couple guys single guys might go out for a couple pops, but very little camaraderie. And I think it's just, again, probably just as a result of you're playing for so much money.
Yeah.
That, the guys just weren't out screwing around. And so in Europe, it was a different deal. Guys would definitely be up and having drinks late and getting after it the next day. But, and that's kind of what, this mid-am circuit is like. A lot of really good guys from a lot of walks of life and different stages. There's the young guys that are in their 20s that are, kind of reliving the glory days of, mini tour golf, likely a lot of them. And then there's the older guys that have families and looking to get away for a few days and compete. So, but everybody ends up in the bar, hanging out together. It's a lot of fun.
All right, let's not exactly throw some of these guys under the bus, but let's just see if we can see if I can highlight. So if you're at one of the bars, or you're kind of shutting down the grill room at a club after an event, who am I most likely to find in there with you?
Do you mean on the mid-amateur circuit?
Yeah. I'm talking about the cocktails, and I'm not talking about like PGA Tour stuff. I'm talking about.
There's a couple. Yeah, there's a couple guys that are.
If
Absolutely.
I walk in,
you can depend on them.
If I walk in and I see A, B, and C, and I'm like, okay, this is gonna be a good night. We're gonna tell some funny stories. We're gonna have some fun here.
There guys like Brett Williams. He's a beauty. He played at Ohio State. Young guy from Baltimore. He's a blast. Matthew Swan from Atlanta. Jeff Osberg is probably, I think, the best mid-amateur player who just hasn't been able to polish his game like it should be. He actually, I think, was he might have been the medalist in the U.S. Amateur a couple years ago when the kid won it at Cherry Hills. I can't remember the guy's name, but Jeff was like the number 1 or 2 seed, and this kid beat him, but eventually won it. But Jeff Osberg's a big stud of a player. I mean, 6'4", hits at 330. I mean, he could compete with the young guys, but he really competes at the bar. I'm trying to think of some of the other guys that are out there. Geronimo, he's a great guy.
Mr. Esteve.
Esteve, yep. Really fun guy. There's a bunch of them. And Jamie Miller is a great guy that likes to get after it. I could go down the list.
Oh, yeah.
They're the norm, not the exception when to find guys that want to hang out. And Owen O'Connell is a legend, I'd say. His game isn't where it used to be, but in the bar, he's like a +8, and he's a fantastic guy, and a legend when it comes to amateur golf. Having been a Walker Cupper and just an absolute stud from Northern Ireland, but he's a usual suspect. So we kind of joke with one another that we can kind of expect to see one another at the bar at Pine Valley late.
There you go. I want to get you out of here on just a couple more. You've been awesome with your time, but I almost forgot to ask you. I can't even fathom the amount of Monday qualifiers or Q school rounds that you've played in your life, and not to expose any old wounds, but to kind of illuminate just how tough it is to make it out there, especially the path that you did with going through the developmental tours and Q school. But anytime a young hotshot college player might be playing a practice round with you or telling you how he's going to go play professionally and do this and do that, do you ever have that one story packed away just for that rainy day where you can say, look, this is exactly what it's like and this is exactly how hard it can be, or how heartbreaking it can be to try and make it as a professional. I'm sure as an agent you must have had that story, but or had that story at that time. Do you have that one story?
There's a couple stories, horror stories, not for me personally, but some people that I witnessed firsthand. I mean, a good friend of mine from going back to when we were 13, 14 years old was a kid named Jackson Brigman. And I don't know if you remember Jackson. He played at Oklahoma State.
Yep.
Yeah, he's from Abilene, Texas, and awesome player as a kid. Played at Oklahoma State. Spent a bunch of years on the what's now the Corn Ferry, and at the Q School at Doral. Final stage, final day, final hole. He makes par to make it on the number, and a guy named Jay Hobby who played at Auburn is keeping his scorecard. And they turn in their scores, and Jackson's elated. He's over at the scoreboard, and they put his score up, and he's 1 over the number. And he freaks out. He goes over and goes to the scoring table and says, look, you got the wrong score for me. I was at, whatever the number is, 327 or whatever it is, and I was at 326. And they say, well, let's get your scorecard. And they look at the scorecard, and Jay had put down a 5 on 18, and he had a 4. Now, this happened 5 minutes ago. Obviously it wasn't malicious. It was just an oversight.
Right.
They both missed it. He signed the card, takes the 5, misses getting his tour card by a shot, and is basically never to be seen again. And, talk about just a bad luck deal, horror story. And, there's others where guys I remember Tim O'Neill, who was a really good player, finished bogey, triple bogey at PGA West to miss by a shot. Same thing, never to be seen again. He never got his card after that. He could finish bogey double and get his card. And
yep.
There's just a fine line. And it kind of goes back to me at that, getting that alternate spot at the Greenleaf that year. It's like it could really go one way or the other based on a lucky bounce or a lucky, something lucky happens, or you pull something out at the end. Me personally, I think that was the one memorable thing that went in my favor. In terms of, God, what they're in for, what these young studs are in for, that, the best players in college, I just don't think they realize how many good players there are that they've never heard of, that have been out there for 10 years, that have been doing it for 10 years, and they've cut their teeth, and they've been grinding, and they know the golf courses. And a lot of these kids just can't miss kids. They just don't make it. Just the numbers are so stacked against them, even if they're, first team All-American in college. And then the lifestyle, it's really some guys just really struggle with it. You're on the road for 4 or 5 weeks. You're spending time in laundromats in Wichita, Kansas. Nothing against Kansas. That might not be a good example for you. But
I'm kidding. Go ahead.
But how about, Sioux City, Iowa, or some of these places we used to play where you're in a laundromat with, not in the nicest neighborhoods, and you're sitting there for 4 hours doing your laundry. It's like the lowest of lows.
Right.
While your peers are back in Chicago or New York or DC, and they're working and they're having a social life, and you're out and, going from small town to small town. It's kind of like the circus, right? The circus packs up and you move on and take your stuff and sit down, and that's your home for a week, and then you move on to the next one. It's pretty grueling. So not everybody's cut out for it.
Yeah.
And, I was fortunate. I think things lined up for me. I made it. Got to play a couple years against, the best players. Tiger's best year on tour, I think, ever was 2001, which is my rookie year. And so I don't look back with any regrets. Had a couple near misses. I was leading LA on the back nine on Sunday in horrible weather. I'll never forget that. I choked, but it was my 5th event my rookie season. I had a 1-shot lead and with 7 holes to play. It's I'll never forget that feeling. But I love what I do now, and I love being able to play again the best golf courses in the world and pick and choose. And it's a lot of these guys will never get to play Pine Valley or Seminole or some of these places we're fortunate enough to play every year.
I feel that we have left tons and tons on the on not discussed. I mean, there's tons of things about Pine Valley and Seminole and what you're going to do in 2020 and all sorts of things. So I hope we can do it again soon, because
sure.
I think we got to we've got to talk a little bit more Kansas basketball. I know that you want to get into that. So, but let's try and do it again soon. And Mike, I appreciate you joining me here at the back of the range.
Yeah, Ben, anytime. Enjoyed chatting with you, and all the best to the Jayhawks.
Yes. And there you have it. Special thanks to Mike Muehr for joining us this week here at the Back of the Range Golf Podcast. Great story. Going to be following him a lot this summer as he competes on the national level on the cocktail circuit. Don't forget, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We're going to have a lot of information detailing my experience at the Latin America Amateur Championship. We'll see you again next week for another episode here at the Back of the Range.